As Dean, I'd love to welcome you to this exciting discussion tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. I'm pleased to welcome the 2024 winners of the Toner Prizes for Excellence in Political Reporting, which recognizes the best national or local political reporting in any medium or on any platform, print, broadcast, or online. The Toner program was established at the Newhouse School in 2009 to celebrate the life and work of late alumna Robin Toner, a 1976 graduate and the first woman to serve as national political correspondent for the New York Times. Here to introduce our 2024 Toner Prize winners is our moderator for the evening, Margaret Talev. Margaret joined Syracuse University following a 30-year career covering American politics and the White House. Margaret covered the Trump and Obama administrations along with both Obama presidential campaigns and Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential run. Experience, drive, and passion for journalism make Margaret the perfect person to lead our Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship, which is a joint effort of the Newhouse School and the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. So with that, let's welcome our panelists.
Over here with you guys, the 2024 Toner Prize for Excellence in National Political Reporting went to this duo you see here, Patrick Marley next to me and Greg Jaffe of the Washington Post for their series called Ottawa County. And this was a series of stories that probed the impact of real ideological rifts in a county in the swing state of Michigan. The headlines for this series said it all. Here's one: in a thriving Michigan county, a community goes to war with itself. A sex educator in Michigan refused to be shamed, then came the backlash. The pandemic has faded in this Michigan county, but the mistrust never ended. And finally, can the exhausted, angry people of Ottawa County learn to live together? What do you guys think? The Toner Prize for Excellence in Local Political Reporting went to a large team from the Philadelphia Inquirer, Anna Orso, Sean Walsh, Julia Terruso, Aseem Shukla, and Layla Jones for their coverage of the race for Philadelphia's 100th mayor. And Julia and Aseem, although Aseem has now moved on to a West Coast job, but are both here to represent for their great coverage. And we're really glad to have you guys here today. Here are some of the headlines that give you a sense of how they approached this big story. Because anything that ends in a 0-0 is a big story. And then the mayor's race ended up making history in addition to being 100. So here are some of those headlines. Philly's next mayor will inherit an unprecedented gun violence crisis. Here's how it's defining the race. Yeah, I heard that story. Philly neighborhoods fall into 6 segregated groups of Democrats. Sounds like a data story. I love data stories. Sherelle Parker is proud of her West Oak Lane roots. As mayor, could she save Philly's middle neighborhoods? What's a middle neighborhood? If you read the story, you'll find out. How Sherelle Parker won the primary, black voters, a boost from labor, and a personal story of Philly grit. So let's start over here with you guys because elections happen on different calendars. Sherelle Parker was inaugurated back in January, so I'm curious how her first year is going and how the reporting that you did back then on the front lines, did it prepare you to cover her first year as mayor? Were you looking at the right stuff and the stuff that mattered?
Well, thank you so much for having us. I will say that, as you pointed out, we're here representing a team, and Anna Orso and Sean Walsh are our City Hall reporters. So they've been really on the ground with her for the first year. I think in a lot of ways it did foreshadow, we did a lot of deep profile work on who the top candidates were and her upbringing, and she was kind of raised by this political dynasty of sorts in Northwest Philadelphia, and had what remains of the Democratic machine kind of behind her as she was running. And a lot of the political battles that have played out in the city, the 76ers want to build an arena right downtown in Philadelphia. And the political coalitions that, we wrote about were exactly what you saw play out in terms of her support for that arena. the laborers who had backed her, who want those jobs. There were a lot of themes that I think we saw play out. What we're still learning is just kind of what kind of a mayor and leader she's going to be and how she's going to tackle some of these big promises she made on the campaign trail. And I think the jury is very much still out there 1 year in. So she's done some kind of controversial things, bringing back city workers to work 5 days a week, trying to clean up part of the city that has an opioid crisis that no mayor has been able to figure out. So yes, but more to learn. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that captures it pretty well. I don't know that I have much more to say than that. I think that part of what we learned in doing this coverage is that Parker represents a very different Philadelphia from the Philadelphia that people who live in Center City and are part of the conversation.
How do you mean? How's it different?
She's based in the northwest of the city, which is far from Center City. It doesn't have great public transit connections. It's very residential. It's very black. It's much poorer than Center City, Philadelphia. And that is a very big part of the city, that sort of that constituency. And there are a lot of people, I think, who see themselves in Sherelle Parker's life story. And the priorities that animate those voters are different than the priorities of people who live in gentrifying hip neighborhoods closer to the center.
Are they more basic priorities? Like, in some ways, did you see it, not to nationalize every story, we'll talk about that later, but in some ways, did it have parallels to the presidential race that we just went through, where you've got a working class that is having different experiences and experiences the economy or finance in a fundamentally different way than, elites or...
I think that's definitely there. I think that, one of the things that stands out to me, and, we wrote about this, was that the experience of violence, of gun violence and that kind of thing, was something that is just much more a part of the daily experience of somebody in the kind of neighborhood that Sherelle Parker comes from. Maybe not that exact kind of neighborhood, but in,
the quadrant.
Yes.
And you're not talking about school shootings, you're talking about going to the grocery store, sitting out on your front step, driving your car in your neighborhood,
much more about that.
waiting for the bus, yeah. Okay. Before I go over to these guys, knowing now what the first year has been like and what some of the questions are about her leadership or what she'll accomplish or whatever, if you could do it over again, which you can't, is there anything that you would have asked? If you could dial the wand back, is there another installment of the series that you would have done? What would it have been?
Well, now I'm nationalizing everything, but now that we have, Trump as the president-elect, I'm very curious what Sherelle Parker thinks of, sanctuary cities, issues that weren't really top of mind in 2023 now are, and I think there's more. It would have been nice to have her on the record on than that is certainly gonna come up now.
If you could go to the clips and pull out that map.
Well, yeah, and I think it's gonna be really interesting how she and other big city mayors kind of push back against Trump in his second term. I don't know if it'll be the same as it was in 2016 when, at least then Philly had a mayor who was very kind of like protective of the city. And I don't know if she's going to fight those battles the same way.
Yeah, great. What did your exhausted, angry voters in Ottawa County do on election night? We know what they did in the presidential race. They picked Donald Trump by a lot. What do they do on the other races that matter? Did that surprise you, or did your reporting for your project lead you to believe that what happened would happen?
Well, you're right that the presidential is not a surprise. Ottawa County is a very Republican place.
About a 20-point gap, right?
Yeah. What is, I guess, for the local elections, the November election didn't matter much. It was all decided in the primary. So we had gone back there in August because that was sort of the first opportunity at the ballot box. Well, there was a recall election, but the first opportunity for voters to sort of weigh in on this new style of governance when these sort of MAGA Republicans took over the local county board. And you kind of came up with a surprise, maybe not a surprise, but the outcome was that some more moderate Republicans were able to win primaries, and so it totally shakes up the makeup of that commission. But by the time November came around, it's not like Democrats were going to make huge inroads. So we saw the picture the primaries where the election was.
Can we rewind this for a second? Because I think if you're working for the Philadelphia Inquirer, you're covering the city of Philadelphia, and there's a centennial mayor's race. You know what you're covering. It is a local story. It might have threads that could appeal to a national audience, but it is a story about the city for the city. But if you are a national newspaper, if you're the Washington Post, when you go into a part of the country that's nowhere near Washington, you're going there for a reason, because it tells an interesting story with tales or threads that go beyond Ottawa County, Michigan. Why, for the benefit of this audience, how did you come to choose Ottawa County as a place where you guys wanted to basically go once a month for a year?
We lucked out a little bit in how we got there. It started with, in the run-up to the 2022 election, an editor wanted Greg to find a county clerk who was sort of wrestling with this issue of election denialism as they defended the election systems that they had. And so he called a bunch of county clerks and talked to them, and then determined that Ottawa County was a very interesting place to go because you have a very conservative county clerk there, but also one who understands that the elections are run and has total confidence in them, and was trying to persuade a very skeptical constituency.
So there's basically one character.
It was one. It was
that election, the Republican, but he's not nonpartisan. He's partisan.
It is a partisan office,
but vowed to do a job in a nonpartisan way. The guy who was trying to do it the OG way, where you're like, just have transparency and conversations and trust that will build trust with people, and it wasn't working, and that had become a story.
And so this great angle that Greg had for it was that he was going to be at a library and to explain how everything works, answers all your questions. And it turned out that same night, a sort of group that had been founded in the Tea Party era was going to have a much larger event. And so Greg wanted to contrast these two events that were happening at the same time, and that's when I got brought in. And so I came in and I covered I attended the other event, the sort of alternative event.
So two dueling events, the trust event and the don't trust event.
Exactly. And so it was originally envisioned as a single story, and then this group took over the county. It was like a bunch of Republicans displaced other Republicans, the new ones were much further to the right, and when they came into power, they just fired everybody and changed the city's logo, or the county's logo, or what its slogan, and sort of like showed that they were going to rule the county in a much different way. And that's when we said, like, let's start going back to this place and digging into it much more deeply.
Can I end out that for one more turn of the story, which is, do you remember how the news first surfaced about the election official? Was it in a local report that got picked up by a wire service, or how did you or the editor you were working with even know that it had happened in some random county in Michigan?
The county clerk, how did we find that particular guy?
Yeah,
so he was one of these folks who, because he loves his job and he's super passionate, he was involved in these associations of county clerks. So I called them and said, hey, who are 3 or 4 really interesting county clerks? And somebody recommended him to me that way. I was going to say one other interesting thing to me about the 2024 election. You're right, Trump carried it by 20 points, but it was one of the few counties in Michigan where Harris outperformed Biden. So if you look at those red weather maps, those weather maps where it looks like all red arrows showing, Trump outperforming or Kamala underperforming Biden, Ottawa County was one little tiny blue arrow going the other direction. Yeah,
not by much, but by a little, right?
Very small amount. It was like 1.4%, but yeah.
Did you figure out why?
I think people were just exhausted. It was one of the places where things got, It was really American politics at its worst, at its most nationalized worst, in their face every day. And I think they were just sick of seeing people they were fighting with at the grocery store.
It's interesting because as you're talking about how you thought to break down the story of the mayor's race, what topics you would cover, what approaches you would cover, there are really a lot of policy issues and pertinent local issues and things like what are the demographics of the different parts of the city and how will gun violence resonate. But what was going on in Ottawa County wasn't the story of inflation, right? It wasn't necessarily even the story about the downsides of undocumented migration or uncontrolled migration waves. It wasn't about daily pocketbook issues. What were the kind of stories that were driving these the just total political fighting and brutal kind of like neighbor against neighbor conversations?
It was fights over whether they rainbow flags, were they okay or were they a sign of the evil and perversion? It was were masks government thought control, government's attempts to impose fascist control over people, or were they necessary? Was the vaccine going to kill you or not? The COVID vaccine going to kill you or not? It was every crazy thing that you'd hear on Sean Hannity or Tucker Carlson. As one of the county commissioners said, who was one of the few incumbents who survived. He said, we used to debate about whether in winter we plowed the streets, twice a day or 3 times a day. And now, I don't even know what we're arguing about anymore.
Right, who's got time to plow the streets when you have a fight over bathrooms? So,
right.
In both of these cases, did you guys get a sense of how people's news consumption impacted their views of what the story was? Sorry, I know that's a trick question because you had no idea this question was coming, so it's fine if the answer is no. But we know that there are, the growing problem of local news deserts. We know that our business is changing fast, and everyone who's in this room who's entering media needs to think about how legacy media is going to transition and how how can you do substantive news on social media. But did you guys get a sense in your reporting of where people were getting the information that was shaping their views, either in Ottawa County or for the mayor's race?
I felt like we could get a pretty clear sense of where people were getting their news. There was a pretty good local newspaper there, but they fell into the same trap that we did. They were just as fake news as we were. They were just as captive of big, shadowy George Soros-like corporate interests as we were. So the locals, the folks on the far right hated them just as much as they hated us. And in fact, the county commission started its own news organization called Simply American for the county. It was like, the Pravda of Michigan.
How did that work?
People read it, I think. But most of it was nationalized. It was mostly stuff coming off kind of far-right social media. It was InfoWars. I know one of the leaders in the county was a big fan of InfoWars and used to boast about, I think she'd actually been on it at one point. It was Tucker Carlson. It was Sean Hannity. It was, you could see all of those. It was what was ever trending on their Twitter feed. I don't know if you want to talk about Jacob Bonema, one of the county commissioners that you spent a lot of time with in terms of where he was getting his news from.
I mean, one thing I'd say is that Ottawa County is not a news desert. They do have a very good local newspaper. They had, these county board meetings were well attended by radio and TV reporters. I mean, there was robust coverage of what was going on there, which was nice to see because there's lots of communities of similar size that have had, gutted newsrooms. Everything was nationalized, and you could, like you say, everybody, you knew what their diet was. I mean, Jacob is someone I spent a lot of time with, but he was absorbing a lot of mainstream news as well as, keeping a pretty close eye on what the more right-wing media was doing as well. So, that to me was a balanced diet. There were other people, I don't know their precise consumption habits, but it seemed to be just this, pipeline of questionable sourcing and just discounting newspapers like ours out of hand without even reading what we wrote.
I was going to say, I was just shocked. I remember at the number of people, Patrick and I would talk about this, who would talk to us about furries, which I don't think actually exist, but they're kids who would use litter boxes instead of bathrooms at schools. They were convinced that this was happening in their county. 4 or 5 people, at county who are involved in county leadership were convinced that this, and you just couldn't unconvince them of it. And where that was coming from, I have no idea.
Yeah, I think for us it was a little different for the mayor's race. Obviously, Philadelphia is registered 6-1 Democratic to Republican. There was less of an ideological split in terms of where people were getting their news. But we did learn that covering a mayor's race really closely was really attractive to readers. People were reading our stuff I think it was surprising even our editors a little bit. And we did do some different things to try to reach people. We did Reddit, Ask Me Anythings. We did Instagram videos just kind of explaining certain things about the race or breaking down. We would write a 2,000-word profile on a candidate that we'd be so proud of, but then we would do the 1-minute Instagram explaining
What everyone watched.
explaining who they were. And there was also a citywide effort, which the Inquirer was part of. It was called Next Philly Mayor or something. And there were, there must have been 100 events that all these candidates would go to, and all the local community newspapers would go, and we would go. And it was actually great access to all, you got to ask them a ton of questions, you got to do all this. And there was sort of a thought maybe this is really the format that boosts citizenship and engagement. And unfortunately, turnout was flat compared to the previous mayoral, which had, it was like a desert compared to the amount of coverage this time. So that's to say, I think we all did a great job, but unfortunately, just in terms of people who came out to the polls, there wasn't, you didn't see the difference there.
No, I think that mostly covers it. I mean, to the point about where are people getting their information? I mean, I think you would find, I was surprised that particularly on the left in the city, you would find people who had, the things that they were consuming or the issues that they found to be really compelling were just very, very different from the ones that maybe a majority of the voters in the
Can you
city.
give an example? Your version of furries?
It was not so outside of bike lanes. It was
Bike lanes, yeah.
I'm thinking about what did Helen Gim run on? She was the sort of more left kind of candidate in that primary, but I think I would say a lot more of these kinds of social justice sort of issues, when what ultimately seemed to animate people's votes is hey, I've been out of a job, or there's.
She's going to address crime and she's from here.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that there was a lot that was being discussed about the niceties of how do we how do we put in better bike lanes, or how do we run the city in a more equitable way, when it seems like a majority of voters just didn't care about those issues.
So interesting. In a few minutes, we're going to turn to your questions, so keep thinking about what you want to ask. I want to turn for a minute, and only a minute, 5 minutes, but that's it, to President-elect Trump and the incoming administration. Obviously, a sea change in Washington with major potential repercussions nationally, globally, etc. You're looking at Republicans holding the House, Republicans taking the Senate, and Republicans retaking the White House, and a majority that has been nominated by Republicans on the Supreme Court. So that's a fair amount of leverage, at least for the first 2 years. How are each of you guys looking at covering this story for your audiences? And what are you hoping collectively that the media's coverage can do? And what are you sort of pre-cringing and thinking, God, I hope this isn't what happens, but I know it might be. But so, how are you going to do it? What's your hope for how our business covers this? And what's your sort of cringe, look away, hope it doesn't devolve into X?
My cringe, and I remember this so vividly in 2017, is, because they're just like, I thought, oh my God, I hope we don't do this again, which is that we were so fascinated by the crazy thing that Trump had said in the Oval Office.
The shiny object of the day.
The shiny object, the thing that was outrageous, and we were so focused on the crazy rhetoric, which was crazy, that I feel like at times we didn't think enough about, okay, what is this administration actually doing? What kind of impact is it having on people's day-to-day lives across the country? And so my cringe is, please let's not run after that shiny object. The thing the crazy.
You mean like the Matt Gaetz story?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's already happened. I mean, it's happening a little bit. The cringe is already a little happening.
It is, and let's focus on what this government is actually doing to our country, for good or for bad or for whatever. But let's focus on the impact it's having in America. Because I think you mentioned as we were walking over, people are already tuning out this stuff. They've listened to it for 8 years at this point, and they're just sick of it.
Yep. Do you have a hope, and have you thought about what you want your role in the quilt to be?
I mean, my hope is that we really think hard about policy, and my hope is that I can figure out a way to write as much as I can outside of Washington to try to ask the question. I think this we're at a moment where our democracy really is threatened, and I think one of the questions that I've been wrestling with is, what do Americans, and I think we all have been wrestling with on our team, is what do Americans think democracy is, and do they still want it? And trying to wrestle with those questions. Why is our government so consistently seeming to fail the people it's supposed to be serving?
Okay, a hope, a cringe, and you. Yes.
I would echo the hope that we focus on policy. And
I'll
You're not the cringe too.
I don't know.
I think that part of the cringe is like this focus on the lineup, the cast of characters.
Right.
I think that matters, but I think that what they do matters more than who they are, what they represent, that kind of thing. I will tell you, I'll answer this question by talking about what I'm looking to do.
Awesome.
And I'm on the West Coast. I'm based in San Francisco at the Chronicle, and I think that a big part of the story now is okay, blue states, ball in your court to show why people should still vote for you, because we saw the biggest bleeding in votes from blue states and not from red states or even from swing states. And so it's what does it mean to govern a blue state when people have so obviously said they don't like the governance in blue states? So what is the policy? What are the policies that are going to be pursued at the local and at the state level? And are blue states going to take this as an opportunity to introspect and to pursue better policies? I think that's a big story. The other thing that I would say from my perspective is, again, nationalizing. The MAGA coalition is very different now than it was in 2016. Now it has all these tech bros in it. It has all these venture capitalists and that kind of thing. And that's a very interesting local story. So I think that, my hope is that to the extent that people pursue these stories about the administration and Trump and that kind of thing, you ground it in local issues or in local considerations. And if I'm very interested in what is it about the psychology of a venture capitalist that led them to enthusiastically support Obama and strenuously oppose Trump and now go the other direction. And so I don't know if that answers all of your questions, but
It's very. I mean, if you were going to cover one governor in America right now, you picked a pretty good, interesting.
I actually don't know that Newsom is the most interesting story coming out of where we are.
Can it
right
be the
now.
mayors?
I think the mayors really matter in California. I think Newsom matters, but I think that if I were on our politics desk, which I'm not, I would like
They
be
don't
much.
rope you in, you're the data guy.
Well, they will repeat it. But like, I'm very interested in the legislature. Like, what are the bills that are making their way through the legislature? Does that change from before? What are the range of topics that people are covering? Newsom is a known quantity, but the legislature is undercovered in California, even though it's so big and so consequential. So,
All right, I'll be quick here. My cringe is the fallout from your cringe, that I'm gonna have to cover every Pennsylvania elected's reaction to what Trump did yesterday or today, and that is already happening. My hope is to kind of get off the hamster wheel a little bit after this election and write about impact, whether it's the federal government's impact on cities and parts of the state can take a while, but if some of his promises come to fruition, the impact might not take that long. And to go back to something I said earlier, kind of like how local leaders, Mayor Parker, what her role becomes, if there's mass deportations in Philadelphia, what does that look like for us?
I couldn't agree more that the focus has to be on what Trump and the administration do rather than what they say. And I mean, the stories there's going to be so many stories of so much fallout from what actually occurs. For cringe, I will say that I would echo what these three said, but the thing that I am sort of dreading is we're going to be 5 minutes into 2025 and it's going to be who's running in 2028. And I just think that's a little premature. I don't think that's healthy. And normal people, you were talking about what do normal people think about? They're not thinking about who's running in 2028. And so I think the media could be a little less focused on presidential politics 24/7.
How will you, obviously parts of your team are covering City Hall every day. How will you go back and do the 1 year later story or the 6 months from now check-in? How will you revisit this prize-winning story? What's your follow-through approach? How do you think about that?
We're in the process of doing it now, the 1 year out for Parker, and kind of evaluating what she said she was going to do, where she is in terms of that. Again, kind of re-explaining some of the political relationships that it likely influenced her decisions. So yeah, we've got kind of a whole package coming out soon on her 1 year in office. And I mentioned those mayoral race stories did really, really well. Everything about her administration has done really, really well. She made history as the first,
in terms of people reading
in terms of people reading it, which is an unfortunate part of our industry, but it's also really gratifying when what you kind of should be reporting on is also what people are interested in. So interest in local Philly government and what the first female mayor of the city in 100 mayors is doing remains something that people are reading. So.
And I know the jury's still out on when your next return trip to Ottawa is, or if and when it's happening. I'm lobbying hard for a return to Ottawa. If you were going back to Ottawa, what is the most important story, or what do you want to ask your kitchen cabinet of 10 people on both sides that you kept talking to?
I think one thing, they've got to hire a county administrator. They fired their last one, and then they interviewed 10 or 11 people, down selected to 4 finalists, and all of the finalists said, we don't want to work here. So just can they find somebody who can serve this board that's a mix of all these coalitions? Can they figure out a way to?
Because nobody wants to do it because it's dangerous, because it's emotionally difficult, because everyone in your community then hates you, because there are threats on your children. Why does no one want the job?
I think just because I think people feel like it's impossible to succeed, that the county's so divided that no matter what you do, half the county's going to be furious with you, and so it's going to be really hard to move this county forward. The interesting thing about the county is that it's a prosperous county with a good tax base, growing revenue, low unemployment, everything is set up for success, but it's just become impossible to manage.
We have an audience full of people who may be looking for jobs in journalism in the coming months. Is that true? Who might be looking for a job in the next year? What about the rest of you? Anyway, it doesn't matter. So if you had the ability to bring an unpaid intern or full-time staffer on board, what are the kind of skill sets that you don't have, maybe, that you would love to bring on board someone who did have? Well, I'll start with that instead of compounding the question, but I guess I'm curious, like, what could anyone in this room bring to the table that would really have helped you tackle either the reporting of, or the presentation of, or the metabolization into the community of the Philadelphia mayor's race story or the Ottawa story?
This is not a direct response to the Philadelphia or Ottawa thing, but I am hiring an
Yes,
intern.
all right. See this man after this event.
And I think it's do you have? There's not one specific thing, but on a data desk, do you have a particular? Do you have a grounding in a data skill that we have overlooked? There's a lot of people who can manipulate tabular data or make maps and that kind of thing, but do you have some experience with sources of data that we don't know? And I think this is much more about your personal story or your subject matter knowledge or that kind of thing than maybe about a raw skill set, or it could be a raw skill set. That's my answer.
Awesome. He's hiring. Did you guys hear that? Okay. What would you be looking for if you could make it happen?
Knowing how to report and write a story well is still like the number one thing that we need.
How do you learn how to do that other than whatever happens in class? How do you actually really learn how to do
going out and doing it, and whatever publication you want to pitch or write for, going out and doing it, and interviewing far more people for a story than you need for that story, just to feel like you really the best advice I ever got is if you're struggling on a story, you probably haven't reported it out enough.
You mean interviewing them in person or talking to them on the phone?
Yes.
Are you sure?
Yes. Do not let them give you an emailed quote, even if they're a politician. But then I also think
You really bring a unique connection to your generation. I mean, I still feel young, but I'm not. And like the reporters on our team who it's their first job, they're like finding things that people are talking about. You know, they led a lot of our coverage on campus protests and Gaza and, you know, like the specialization that you guys might seem obvious to you, but that you can come in with to say, here's what people are talking about in this, you know, space that you might not know exists. It's huge.
For me, I guess just I'll keep it really quick. I think boundless curiosity, just about everything, just being really curious about places and people. And second, I'm really confused about how people get their news, how people make sense of the world. I know, Margaret, you were asking us that question, even more so about young people. And so I think just an understanding of how people are understanding their world and being able to capture and communicate that is really important.
Patrick, you're hiring. What are you looking for?
You were talking about talking to people. I would help hire an intern. I was the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel for 18 years in the state capitol, and we would get an intern every summer who was a student at the University of Wisconsin, and we had a lot of great kids, but the thing that would always shock me is it was like, whoa, talk to people, and it's like, yeah, you got to get out there, you got to talk to legislators, you got to talk to real people. People are going to shut their door in their face. Go knock on the next door. You just got to do that. And so I think the hardest thing for students is to start identifying stories and come up with story ideas. And that's the thing I worry about least, because it's like that comes eventually.
And also, when you talk to that person, if you're listening to them also, they might tell you what the story is.
Exactly. You might learn some things. They might tell you some things that surprise you.
When you guys ask us some things that surprise us, it is time for the Q&A. I'm going to, Lily's got a microphone. So yeah, put your hand up if you've got a question. If you would tell us your name and what you're studying and one concise question, please.
Hi, everybody. My name is Luke. I'm a junior studying broadcast journalism and political science in Newhouse and Maxwell. I wanted to ask about something you guys touched on a lot in the discussion, which is about trust in the media. You guys both, all of you, went into places that are maybe underreported on or not reported on enough and don't see reporters come in very often. And I think that's one of the reasons why trust has been eroded, is because people don't see journalists in their community very often. But beyond that, what are some of the ways that you think that we can rebuild trust in media institutions, which are now kind of at a record low?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an ongoing challenge. I do think just being a person with people when you're talking to them, explaining the story you're working on and why you want to hear their thoughts, and hearing out their concerns, and reiterating that you're trying to get out of your bubble and to hear all experiences, and often following up with them after the story to see what they thought, even if you think they might not have the nicest things to say. So none of that is super revelatory, but it's a start.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think works really well, is when you have these person-to-person contact, and when a reader calls you and they're mad about something you wrote, and you hear them out, and sometimes they're right, and you have to acknowledge that, like, well, I didn't make an error, but I could have phrased this better, or I could have included this other argument that an opponent of this idea made. And you can use that to inform your future coverage, right? Like, I covered the legislature for years. A lot of times it's like, well, that didn't get into this story, but I'm going to write about this bill 30 more times, and it'll make it in all the other times. So it makes you a better reporter. I do think that, like, all of that helps, because you do get a response when people feel heard. But that's one person, and you're right that there's this broader opinion of the media that is not great, and I'm not quite sure how we rebuild it. I'm really interested in how we can do that, because I'm not sure what all the answers are. People have such a broad definition of, like, I hate the media, but the media is a lot of things, right? It's the influencer on TikTok now, and it's Sean Hannity, and
You hate the media you hate, but you love the media that you love.
Exactly.
I saw, there you go, right up there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tim. I'm a sophomore, and I'm studying both political science and magazine news and digital journalism at Newhouse and Maxwell. So, for both of your stories, I guess, like, particularly for the Washington Post team, you talked a lot about trying to capture the general mood of an electorate or, like, groups of people, which, I imagine for people on the far left or the far right, it's like, it'll be pretty easy because they tend to be the loudest, but for those in the middle, like those who are, like, tuned out of politics, or, like, just the general, like, median voter, how do you go about capturing the mood of a general, like, population, both for like a national level or local level?
It's a tough one, because I feel like with the stories we were doing in Michigan, I think your critique is a really good one. I think one thing that we probably missed with those stories is we were talking to the 30% or probably 25% of the county's voters who are really, really focused and passionate about this. And there was a huge swath of ignorance in this county, that as angry as people were, there was probably 50% who had no idea that any kind of fight was happening,
Yeah.
or any kind of dispute was happening. And so I think that's one thing our stories didn't reflect. That's probably one area where we failed in some way. And so yours is a really good, smart question, and I don't have a great answer to it because we didn't do it.
You have a thought on this?
Yeah, and it's obviously not directly about Ottawa County, but it's kind of in response to both of the questions that were asked. And I think a lot of it is, as members of the media and beyond just reporters, like, we have to be humble that most people don't at this point consume what we produce. Subscription numbers are pretty low, and, like, we are competing, whether we like it or not, with TikTok and Instagram and all this other kinds of stuff. And the medium has always been the message, and I think the news media is very behind on meeting people at the level where they where they have become habituated to consuming any kind of content, whether it's news or entertainment or whatever. And that's where I think a lot of where the median voter is, which is a less informed, less bothered voter, and they're not going to take the time to go and read a story in their local paper or in the Washington Post. And we need to figure out how to meet them if we want them to care about what we're doing.
I think it's a really interesting question, though, before we go to the next question. I think, like, when you're reporting a story, there's kind of two ways to talk to people. There's a part where you've got your notebook out and you're quoting them, and you're like, what's your name? Is this how you spell it? Well, how old are you? Where are you from? What's your cell phone number? Can I call you if I want to follow up with you? And maybe it's on camera or maybe it's print. But then there's also the kind of softer underlying reporter part where it's an off-the-record conversation and you can give that person that assurance. You're like, I'm just trying to get to know the community. And maybe if you have the luxury of being in town for 3 days instead of 1 day, maybe you're just like, maybe you're in the Home Depot parking lot, maybe you're at a diner, maybe you're asking one person who you know to connect you with 5 people who you don't know, and you're telling all of them, I'm not going to quote you, I'm never going to quote you, just help me get to know your town. And those kind of conversations can help you to speak authoritatively about it. If you're doing a package for TV, obviously it's harder because you want the image, you need something to be on camera. But even so, when you're writing the script, when you are kind of having the back and forth with the anchor, talking about the reporting that you did, just like dropping into a place that you don't know is different than covering the community where you are all the time. And even if you go back once a month for a year, you still don't live there, right? So I do think that's some of the homework that you're doing is strategically you're thinking like, what do I need to capture for the story, and what would just really help me to learn, to have like a place to start here. Okay, we have time for a couple more hands. One in the back, and then we'll come down here afterwards.
Hi, my name is Matthew Abrizeze. I'm a second year, and I'm studying BDJ at Newhouse. And my question is pretty much for the Philadelphia story. You guys talked about how you were using kind of Instagram and those Reddit Ask Me's about how to kind of like engage yourself in the community and ask more questions and kind of like insert yourself in that setting. Have you guys found any more kind of methods aside from those social medias to kind of embed yourself in that community more?
I'd love to hear your ideas. The newspaper has a communities desk that was trying to do some of that work, kind of like going out into community events without an agenda, just to be a reporter from the Inquirer, kind of at events in communities that we don't cover enough, and to try to rebuild some trust. We didn't do a ton of work as the politics team with that desk. I think you run into this issue where sometimes the people with the subject matter expertise aren't the people who are doing the communities desk work. So I think there's a lot more that could be done, a lot more collaboration. Would love to hear any ideas you have, but I think a lot of those virtual things were kind of the extent of the new stuff we did, but we've continued doing it. Like during the presidential election, we did more of that too. Did I miss anything?
Okay. Right down here. The Descendants.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie. I'm a freshman studying broadcast digital journalism and political science. You guys put a lot of focus on the public tuning out the media due to that oversaturation of that shiny new object reporting, and consequently that the media should be now focusing on the policy instead, and that should be a priority of media institutions. Do you think that the public will actually respond to these stories in any way, and that kind of this is a two-parter, should the public at large be responsible for trying to create some of these stories through social media, trying to report more on this policy instead?
Well, as you're a freshman?
Yeah.
So you'll be doing a semester in Washington in a year and a half or so, yeah.
Yeah, I think readers will read about policy when it's done well and connected to their lives. And if Trump is going to carry out some of the things he's saying, then I think there'll be tremendous reader interest in that, right? Like he's talking about deporting millions of people. If he does even a fraction of that, the public's going to have a response to that. Some are going to support him greatly, some are going to oppose him greatly. There's going to be all kinds of litigation. There would be, you'd see people with guns showing up and arresting people and putting them somewhere until they got them on a plane to take them away. I think you'd find a lot of interest in that. There's plenty of policy that's a little drier than that. Like how much should how much should we spend on highways? How much should we spend on the military? And you've got Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy coming in and saying they're going to just totally change the budget process. That may open some eyes as to like exactly what the government spends its money on. So I think there's tons of room to connect with readers on those stories.
We have time for one more. I had a question. Okay, in the back.
Hi, I'm Megan, and I'm studying broadcast digital journalism and also political science. To kind of piggyback off of Jamie's question, you did discuss a lot about reporting on legislation. Marty Barron was here, I think, a month or two ago, and he kept using this term called sane washing, essentially kind of sanitizing a lot of rhetoric that's coming out of Donald Trump and other sort of people on that side about, sanitizing what they're saying. How do we balance focusing on legislation while also trying to be accurate and not sort of normalizing this rhetoric?
So how do you write or cover policy without inadvertently normalizing presidential behavior that potentially dismantles 75 years of post-war architecture or what the framers intended or whatever?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of language that has to be in almost every article you write, which can get a little tiresome and people can start glossing over it. I mean, how many times when we were reporting on the election did we mention Trump's felony convictions? And it was like there were these paragraphs that we just kind of had in every story. So I think it's an ongoing challenge on how to do that in a way that, you are providing the historical context of what's happening and the potential damaging effects of it, and how do you remind people of that and give them that context in such a way that you're not sane washing, but also it doesn't just kind of get glossed over.
Where I maybe disagree a little bit with Marty, I think, is I'm just not sure that it matters that much when we call out, when we say, I'm wrestling with my words here. What Trump says crazy, crazy stuff when we write about it in the Washington Post. We're not persuading anybody because the people who are reading us already think that this is crazy and exhausting. And so I get the argument about sane washing, but I also just feel like that horse has left the barn. We're not speaking to the whole country. We're not convincing people who are on the fence that they should be appalled or should worry about this. I just feel like, I often feel like we're just bystanders to this whole debate. And in some ways, I worry that the opposite happens to us too. I worry, like we were talking about numbers and knowing numbers. I will say, if you write a story that's critical of Trump at the Washington Post, or that quotes him saying something is insane and you're appalled by it, that will get huge readers. If you write anything critical of the other side, you get slammed with, or of Democrats, you'll get slammed with, why are you sane washing this person? I'm canceling my subscription. I don't want to, why are you trying to equate these two people? And so I just worry, like all the incentives on us can be, I guess I'm wrestling with this. All the incentives are to not write stories that our readers might disagree with, or not write stories that make our readers uncomfortable, because they don't want to click on them. I think because of the way
You're not saying that's what you're doing. You're saying that's the kind of pressure atmosphere.
It's the pressure atmosphere, but I think inevitably becomes what you end up doing even though you shouldn't. because you know that something will generate a huge audience and lots of praise, and you know that something will generate a smaller audience and endless headaches. And how do you balance those things? Like, it just inevitably gets into your head whether you want it to or not, and you can tell yourself, I'm not going to fall victim to it, but I worry that we do.
You know, the polling on the front end, the exit polling on the back end, all the focus grouping that we did, to Tim's question about what your sort of average person who's not hyper-focused on this and is kind of pragmatic more than ideological, told us that the economy and people's dissatisfaction with the way they personally experience the economy, inflation, that was their driving reason, either for voting in the affirmative for Trump or deciding to stay home rather than casting a ballot for Harris. And so the potential for disruptive policy changes that we've been talking about here is fundamentally, with the exception of tariffs, different than the conversation around the economy. I think whether we're writing for a national audience or for a local audience, 6 months from now or a year from now, there'll be some kind of a referendum, thumbs up, thumbs down, or not sure yet, for what people thought they were getting by voting or deciding not to vote versus what they actually got. And some of this is all conjecture right now. We can't know how voters will feel about it until something has happened for them to experience. That leaves us with a big opportunity for a follow-up conversation, so I hope we get to have it. We're out of time. On behalf of Di Lodato, on behalf of the Toner family and the Toner program, on behalf of the Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship, and the Newhouse School, I want to thank you guys for being here. I want to thank you guys a lot for being here. See this man about a job, and we'll hang out for a couple minutes if anyone has any questions off mic, off camera. Thank you very much.